Chapter 10. Egypt, the Desert. We stood with all our kit chatting on the dockside, waiting for transport. It materialised in the form of Arab buses which had seen better days, and we were soon on our way to God knows where. I could not possibly have imagined that Egypt was like this. We seemed to have stepped back in time, I don't know how many years. My impressions of this backward country were most unfavourable. The Arabs appeared to be surviving just as their forebears had done, living in squalid, filthy huts on the sand. Dozens of thin, scruffy children were everywhere, and scrawny animals were roaming around freely. I wondered where the hell the army had brought us. Fortunately, we got to know better parts of the country later on. Before we could bat our eyes, we were on army trucks, heading for we knew not where. That was always a most frustrating thing with the army. Nobody ever told us where we were bound. We just arrived. No one said, "Now look, lads, we're doing so-and-so." Until D-Day. Then it changed. We went via Suez and Ismailia, then along the Sweetwater Canal. We ended up at a large tented camp about a mile west of the Suez Canal, which was the main British military base in Egypt, Kassassin Camp, and it was indeed just a camp. There were very few brick buildings. Kassassin was described as that bugbear of all British troops newly arrived in the Middle East. It was alleged if you hadn't already got jippy tummy, this was the place you could expect it. The weather now was very hot. Very quickly we dumped our kit in a tent allocated to us and went to another tent where we were issued with khaki drill shirts and shorts to wear in place of our denims. If you could have seen those shorts, well, they were good for a laugh, but they were cool in the scorching sun. They had a double buckle fastening at the waist and wide legs, which reached almost to our knees. They must have been kept in stock since the Indian campaigns. We now made our way to another large tent, which was the dining hall. Trestle tables and forms were set out, which was certainly an improvement. Our first meal in Egypt was a disaster. I could not hazard a guess as to what kind of meat it was, but even worse were the mashed green sweet potatoes. I went hungry that day, and many days. I became anxious about my weight because I was only a slight 10.5 stones and I was now 24 years of age. Fortunately, the food did improve. I think even the flies were pleased about that. There were swarms of thousands of them, and even when we were eating or drinking, they would settle on our lips, and we had to constantly wave them off our food. I don't know how we avoided disease, and I reckon I must have had an iron constitution. Give me good army grub, cooked by good army cooks any day. The huge tented camp was in the desert, the inhospitable desert. No give, just take. Our billets, again, were square tents, just about large enough to hold 20 of us. They had 3-foot walls which had to be rolled up every day, so that sand blew right through and covered everything. The whole military base was set on sand. There was a brick-built cinema and another large tent, which was the canteen. I remember one particular thing about the canteen. When I first went in, a soldier was playing a piano, and he played a tune I had not heard before, Warsaw Concerto. It made me think of home, and I have never forgotten that tune. There were no other amenities whatsoever, and we were some miles from the nearest town of Ismailia. Still, we made our own fun, and a great deal of our spare time was passed talking, telling jokes, and having a laugh, and much time was passed writing letters, and at a later date, airgraphs, one-page letters which, after being photographed and censored, were reduced in size to about 5 by 4 inches to reduce bulk for transit purposes. Very soon we started a training programme, and in order to get us used to the desert heat and sand, we did much route marching into the desert, up and down the dunes, mile after mile. First it was 10 miles, then 15 and 20, and we could only use our water bottles when our officer said so. That was all part of our initiation to desert conditions, and to any circumstances we might have to face in the future. The sun beat down mercilessly during those marches, and yet at night it was always cold. But with day after day of scorching hot sun, we soon became used to it, and our bodies quickly tanned. At weekends, anybody off duty could get army transport to Ismailia. My pals and I made a few trips there. It was a fairly large place, but not very clean. There was no entertainment, but it was a change of surroundings. I remember young boys who haunted off-duty soldiers to buy obscene postcards. The strangest thing happened during one trip into town. When I was billeted at Mareham-le-Fen, back in England, one lad in my section was called Ernie Booth, who lived in Glossop in Derbyshire. Well, as I was walking in Ismailia, whom should I bump into but Ernie? That lad had come out to the Middle East on a later draft than me and had been posted to the Durham Light Infantry, and yet here we were, meeting again in Ismailia. I then lost touch. 40 years later, I received a telephone call, and the caller wanted to know if I was ever stationed at Mareham in 1942. Again, Ernie Booth had come into my life, and of course we remained in touch. He'd been wounded during his first action at Primosoli Bridge in Sicily, and ended his war in Egypt. The powers that be were calling for volunteers for the paratroops, and a display was being held to encourage the would-be paratroopers to transfer from their present regiment. My pal and I went along, and were impressed enough to think about it. I'm pleased that think is all we did, as I'm sure that I would have ended up in the deadly fiasco at Arnhem, which never should have been. I obviously took part in many actions and skirmishes, but Arnhem was dreadful. So instead, I took a course to learn to manoeuvre a Bren carrier. This was a lightly armoured, tracked vehicle used for carrying half a dozen men, and it had a Bren gun fixed to the front end. It was a good course, and gave me an insight into the capabilities of that workhorse. Well, I passed the test, learning to control the carrier up the steep sand dunes to almost a point, and then topple forward down the other side. On roads, the vehicle could travel at 40 miles an hour, and to drive a Bren carrier fast across the desert and up and down large sandhills at speed was an exhilarating experience. Mind you, if there were any German 88mm guns around, it would be a different matter altogether. For a while, we had to guard thousands of German prisoners of war who'd been taken at Alamein. They looked really exhausted and were almost all about the same age as us and wanted to be sociable. It was not their fault they were at war, and they seemed very pleased to have been taken prisoner. We would take small working parties about the camp doing maintenance. 2 of the young Germans in my party spoke very good English and were quite well educated, wanting to make conversation, and I, rightly or wrongly, obliged. Their names were Helmut Beckermeyer and Alfred Decker, both from Bremen in northern Germany. They told me all about their families and homes and gave me their addresses. I formed the opinion that not all Germans were bad, the same as not all English are good, because I'd come across some awful characters in my time in the army. Granted, we were at war, but I felt that if I had been a prisoner of war, I would have appreciated my guard showing me some kindness. So my favourable reaction to the young Germans was to give them little treats like biscuits and chocolate. They were soldiers like us, Wehrmacht, not SS. Eventually, I wrote a letter to the parents of those boys, telling them that I had met their sons and that they were alive, well and happy to have been taken prisoner. Apparently, they had not known this news. The mother of Alfred Decker wrote back, thanking me for my kindness and sending me their only photograph of Alfred. I still have that letter and snap among my souvenirs. God had been good to me, and I felt I was upholding my faith by being kind to them, and I never regretted the action I took. The letter read as follows. Dear Mr. Cheall, I'm glad I am finally able to thank you for what you have done for me. It was very kind of you to forward my son's letter to me, and thanks to you I learned he was alive and felt well. But unfortunately he did not know himself anything about our fate. I am so happy he found in you a man who could understand him so well. Now he is asking me to send him a photo of his. You can imagine it is not easy to part with the only picture of my son that I've got. But since Alfred has told me you've treated him as a comrade, I will fulfil his wish. I am hopeful that my son will soon be released and we shall see him again. Should you ever be in Bremen, you will always be very welcome in my home. Yours sincerely, W. Bozinski. Bremen. By late March 1943, I was almost black with the heat of the sun. We'd been in Egypt for 2 months and were wondering why we had been sent out here to the Middle East only to be messing about. It seemed that this was all we were doing. But ours was not to reason why, though the routine we had gone through these past weeks had been an experience I would always remember. We had all now become used to the conditions at Kassassin. Even the food had shown some improvement, but the flies persisted in being a torment and thrived on the sweat of our bodies. We had not been forgotten, though. Things were soon to get moving. All of a sudden, orders were issued, preparing us for a move. There was a war being fought, and the time had come for us to take part in the action. Very few of the lads at Kassassin had been in any sort of action against the enemy, so they really had no idea what they were going to have to face in the very near future. At least, having been at Dunkirk, I had a good idea what to expect, although this time I expected the Germans to be on the receiving end. Chapter 11. Back to the Green Howards. We had now been toughened up and had got used to the heat, and at last orders came through for a move. Our platoon sergeant came into the tent with orders for us to get it organised in readiness for a move the next day, and there were no questions about our destination. Most of these young soldiers were full of confidence and high spirits, and had not yet been initiated into the realities of facing a ruthless enemy. I had been with the BEF in France, and had not forgotten all the whys and wherefores, and knew when to keep my head down and when to be aggressive. But when the time came, They had the opportunity to show what stuff they were made of and quickly adapted to the situation in which they'd found themselves. And back in those days, none of them showed any reluctance whatsoever about going forward to join the frontline units. Anyhow, it was not before time that we took our leave of this fly-ridden place. We climbed onto the 3-tonners and were soon on our way to Cairo airport. Travelling through Cairo was an experience never to be forgotten. It was a bit of a nightmare for the drivers. Simply masses of people and vehicles, and there did not appear to be many rules of the road. I had never before seen so many people in one place. Of course, it was the first time that I had had the dubious pleasure of being in a Middle Eastern city, but it was soon left behind us as we headed for the airport. At the airport, we were each weighed with our kit. There would be about 100 of us on the draft. Groups of 20 were assigned to Dakota aircraft, 10 on each side of the plane, and we sat on a wooden bench. It was all new to me, in fact. I think to all of us. We just had not flown before, but in the army so many new experiences were encountered that we just took them in our stride. I do recall the flight was very bumpy. Soon after we'd taken to the air, we passed over the pyramids and Sphinx, which I'd previously only read about. However, we were not on a sightseeing trip, but flying to join the 8th Army. The flight was uneventful, as our RAF had at this time mastery of the air. Landing at Benghazi to refuel, stretch our legs and have some sardine sandwiches and tea, we had a little time to look around and see the devastation of war which had gone back and forth over this ground during the past 2 years. Burnt-out vehicles and tanks were everywhere, together with piles of rubble which had once been buildings. Back onto the plane and onto our destination, Tripoli, capital city of Libya. The landing almost ended in disaster because shell holes pockmarked the runway, the fighting having passed this way only recently. As our plane touched down, the pilot, good as he was, could not avoid one of the craters. Fortunately, we'd lost speed, but even so the plane tipped over at an angle of 45 degrees, bending the propeller and throwing us all forward. But it was our kit bags that saved many of us from injury. Some of us had been asleep and had received a rude awakening, and soldiers, being what they are, the air was blue with bad language. It was not far off dusk when we crawled out of the plane and sorted our kit, then walked across the tarmac to an aerodrome. No time was lost in bringing on the rations, so different from Dunkirk and so well organised. We had a meal and sat talking about the flight and also what our next move might be. Somebody then started to play a mouth organ, which never failed to set us all singing, and the songs of the day usually made us all think of home, the married men about their families, and we would all think about tomorrow. It had been a long day, and we soon settled down for the night. Sleep came easy. We had excellent NCOs in those days, and we got on well with them. Next morning the sergeant awoke us all to say that we would be here for 2 days to await orders as to our next move. As soon as we had eaten, a new order was given to pack up and get cracking across the fields to a tented camp, which was about 2 miles from Tripoli. Our time would be ours to do as we wished. We were allowed into the city, which did not appear to have suffered much by the passage of war. This was where Rommel had come ashore to chase the British out of Africa, which of course he almost did. However, The dockside and harbour installations had been almost completely destroyed by the retreating army. German and Italian ships lay wrecked and parts sunken in the water at all kinds of angles. The RAF had created hell for the Germans, who were now paying the penalty for their wrongdoings. The harbour would take some clearing before it could be used to shorten our supply lines. Now, back at camp, we embussed once more to another destination, but moving ever nearer to the front line, travelling over the very ground upon which fierce battles had so recently taken place. It was 28th of March 1943 as we passed through Medellin and then Mareth, where, unknown to us at the time, 69th Brigade with 50th Division, my former division, had fought so magnificently against fierce enemy resistance. My old 6th Battalion had played a very significant part in the fighting for Mareth and had suffered many casualties, together with other units of the 69th Brigade. Passing through Gabes, where the name signs were still in place, it seemed hardly possible that Kassassin was almost 2,000 miles away. We were now in southern Tunisia, where we came to a halt and debussed to await further orders. We then marched about 10 miles across country and came to a rest in a clearing among the sand dunes waiting for orders. Almost within the hour, we were being sorted. There must have been about 500 of us going in as reinforcements to the 50th Division, but at this time I was in the East Yorks. A jeep arrived and an officer came towards us, and I recognised him at once. He was Captain Carmichael, and the last time I had seen him was at Frome in Somerset with the 6th Green Howards when he was the transport officer. Since in the past I had been company commander's batman, I knew all the officers and they knew me. Now we had to fall in threes. The captain walked along the line and a corporal was with him. Coming closer, the officer looked us all over, thinking his own thoughts, probably along the lines, "Poor lads, more cannon fodder," because he would realise that most of the new draft had never seen any action. The captain had come to collect soldiers to replace casualties in the 5th East Yorkshire Regiment and the 6th and 7th Green Howards. Captain Carmichael was a very popular officer and never flaunted his position. When he came to me, he recognised me at once and said, well, Cheall, you've caught up with us at last." I replied that I was afraid I hadn't, and that I had been in the East Yorks since December and was not very happy about it. I knew the man and I could talk to him like that. "That's no problem, Cheall. I can do something about that." Then he said to the corporal, "Transfer this soldier to the 6th Green Howards with immediate effect." It was just as easy as that, and my army record shows that it happened on 29th of March 1943. I was lost for words and just said, "Thank you, sir. It's good to be back in the Green Howards," and he passed on. I could hardly believe it. It meant leaving the pals I'd made in the 11th Battalion and on the Queen Mary, but in the army one became used to that. Strange as it may seem, I never saw the captain again, although I remained with the Green Howards for another 18 months. I wonder if he survived the war. I went into C Company, and regretfully I was separated from my pals. John Bousfield and Norman Young went to the 5th East Yorks, and Arthur Oxley to the 6th Green Howards, but not in my platoon. John and Arthur were fated to be killed very soon, but more of that later. So, the esprit de corps of the British Army had cropped up again, and it was a great feeling to be a Green Howard once again. Those of us who had been transferred to the 6th Battalion departed and marched about 3 miles to the area where the 6th were taking a rest, which they certainly deserved. They were just lazing about and looking very miserable and tired. At the time, we had no means of knowing that they'd just taken part in the fierce Battle of Mareth, where bitter confrontations with the enemy had caused devastation to their numbers. Only those who have been involved in an action where they've seen their comrades blown to smithereens know what it is like. Nobody else can even begin to imagine what a boy goes through. Some take it all in their stride. Others for a time dwell upon their experience. Looking over the faces of the tired lads, they showed signs of strain, which was quite understandable. Although I had been in the 6th for 2 years and had known many of them by name and more by sight, I could hardly believe that I did not recognise anybody. But it was C Company I was now in, and I had previously always been in B. But the fact that I did not know anybody held no significance at the time. After I had been designated a platoon and section, and time was free for a while, I decided to wander over to B Company to find some of my old mates who I'd known since Territorial Army Camp in 1939. I was stunned by what I found. They were all strangers to me, except one. Harry Simpson had been a company commander's batman in England, and remembered me, of course. He seemed very depressed and gave me the impression that he needed a rest from the trauma of battle. When I asked him how come I did not recognise anybody, he said, "Well, Bill, it's good to see somebody I know from the old days. And since it might do me good to unburden myself, I'll tell you what's happened to the 6th that you remember." I found it to be a very sad and unbelievable story. The 69th Brigade of 50th Division left England from Gurok on 3rd of June aboard HMT Multan in a convoy escorted by cruisers and destroyers, and at one time an aircraft carrier. They called at Freetown, as did all convoys remaining from the 6th to the 20th of June, but nobody was allowed ashore. The company then continued to Durban in South Africa, arriving on 4th of July. All troops disembarked for 7 days. Apparently, this was a happy time, as the South Africans were generous and very friendly. The voyage then continued on board HMT Mauritania, arriving at Port Tewfik on 21st of July 1942, where they stayed at Kassassin Camp. They remained there until 7th of August, when they set sail for Famagusta, Cyprus, embarking upon destroyers. In Cyprus, they began intensive training in the mountain and preparing defence works at Limassol, Greece and Crete having recently fallen to the enemy. They then continued training in the form of long tactical marches over mountain tracks and choking white dust. All training was geared to make us prepared in case the Germans invaded the island. In November, the battalion moved to Palestine. On 28th of November, because of the war situation, the division was on the move again to Persia. More defence preparation and more training until the end of January 1943, but only for 2 weeks. On 12th of February, the 69th Brigade arrived at a camp near Alexandria. The next day it moved again to Akroma near Tobruk, getting nearer the action. On 22nd of February, the 6th went into the line of battle. For some weeks they prepared defences and sent out recce columns into the desert, sometimes for 3 days at a time. There were casualties and some were taken prisoner. They were constantly on the move in the desert and the conditions were dreadful. On 30th of May, the battalion moved yet again, new positions and defence works to prepare under fire from the enemy and the elements in the form of hot dust storms. The water ration was 2 pints a day for all purposes. Try it sometime. Here they were attacked by the enemy and suffered many casualties, but we counterattacked and were successful. They were constantly on the move in the desert, taking part in many battles, and eventually most of the brigade, 5th East Yorks and the 6th and 7th Green Howards, took up defensive positions in what were called boxes, so that all sides could be defended. Owing to the way that the war was going at the time, the enemy were far better equipped than we were. Better anti-tank guns and larger tanks carrying formidable 88mm and the dreaded mobile 88mm which served as anti-tank, anti-aircraft or artillery pieces using different kinds of shell. Having a superior quantity of weapons, the Germans surrounded the box, and to cut a long story short, before the British surrendered, many had been killed. The remainder, apart from some who managed to escape, were taken prisoner at Gazala. That is the story I was told by Harry, so no wonder I did not see any faces I recognised. At that time, the Germans played havoc with our desert army. That is roughly what happened to the 6th Green Howards, but it was reformed. Had I stayed with them, the chances of my being here today would have been remote. Almost all of the rebuilt battalion consisted of replacements for those who'd been killed or captured in the Gazala battle in the desert, in the days when things were going against us. That would have been my fate if I had not left my unit in 1942 because of my sinus trouble. After talking to that disconsolate lad, I made my way over to C Company, and again did not see anybody I knew, except the company commander, Captain Hull, who I knew had joined the 6th Battalion as a second lieutenant in September 1939, when we were billeted in Lytton Street, Middlesbrough. It's he who wrote a book, The Man from Alamein, by C.M. Hull, and the story is fact. He was a very brave officer, having proven himself in France in 1939, and would go through hell for his company of men. After being put into number 15 platoon, I began getting to know the others, and found out that my section leader was a young man named Lance Corporal Coughlin. I had tiffin, lunch, with them, then sat to one side, my brain in a turmoil, remembering all the old names and faces I had known since August 1939. But in the infantry, one had to learn to come to terms with sudden death and changing circumstances and get on with life. I did just this and soon became involved in what we had to do, getting to know that most of the lads belonging to the new 6th were just as good soldiers as those I had known in the past. While we were at the spot where I joined the company, the mobile showers came up and gave us a treat. Some of the boys said that it had been a month since they'd seen a shower. The battalion was having a 3-day rest before it moved forward to face more action. Orders came to move. The Germans had fortified positions among the hills in Tunisia, and we had to assault them. We embussed and travelled a distance of about 60 miles. Abandoned German guns and all sorts of paraphernalia of war were everywhere, but not as bad as Dunkirk. It was dark when we arrived at our destination, and we found ourselves in more or less open ground, about 5 miles from the enemy-held hills. We rested here that day and prepared for battle, receiving details of the expected opposition and the situation in general relating to our attack. Within 24 hours, we were told that we were going into action and to prepare ourselves. Chapter 12. Wadi Akarit, into battle. The enemy were dug in at a place called Wadi Akarit in Tunisia, North Africa, and had to be sent packing, to use General Montgomery's words. The code name for the forthcoming battle was Operation Scipio. As the day dawned, we embussed and were taken to a clearing about 3 miles away, which was screened from the enemy by trees. By now it was getting dusk, and we were assembled and told in great detail, and in no uncertain terms, what was expected of us. Also, the method to be used to dislodge the enemy. Great emphasis was placed upon our part, the 6th Battalion. This was so different to the attitude of our commanders previously, when we faced the enemy without any knowledge of the part we had to play. Unlike years ago, we were treated not as a number, but as a human being by our officers, and we responded accordingly by showing more interest than had previously been the case, simply because we'd been put in the picture. Our officers too showed greater enthusiasm for the conflict, knowing that they had the confidence of those who were behind them in what was to be done. The enemy were ensconced on hills in the distance, only 4 miles away, and the plan of attack was as follows. The enemy held a good, strong position, overlooking our every move on the perfectly flat plain over which we were to advance. He had the advantage of looking down upon us from, on the left, Jebel Fatnassa. Jebel is the Arabic for hill, reaching a height of about 152 metres. On the right was Jebel Rumana, which was about the same height, and these hills were joined by Hashana Ridge. Both hills were rather steep at the front, but our battalion was to attack a section just right of centre, where the ground was level. Running through the valley was Wadi Akarit, an old dried-up riverbed. In the background there was a range of hills which stretched as far as we could see, and running along the length of the front of the lower ground was an anti-tank ditch about 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide, the whole area being mined and barbed wired. We were given all the necessary information relating to the attack, and with strict instructions to give the buggers hell. The attack was to go in as follows. The 51st Highland Division on the right, the 4th Indian Gurkha Division on the left. Our 69th Brigade would attack the centre gap, with the 5th East Yorks on the left, the 7th Green Howards in the centre, and the 6th Green Howards on the right. But owing to the narrowness of the gap, the 6th would be in front of the 7th, and would assault a prominent feature known as Point 85. Then we would spread out and let the 7th in. We crossed the start line at 0400 hours on a lovely moonlit night. It was difficult to believe that we'd soon be in the heat of the battle. It was almost eerie. Everything was so quiet at this early hour. And then all of a sudden, as if somebody had pressed a switch, everything came to life as our 25-pounders opened up, and we moved forward at a steady walking pace. We were led by our officers onto the flat plain, devoid of trees, and kept a distance of 4 or 5 yards apart. Advancing at a steady walking pace towards our objective, we'd gone about 1 mile when the enemy let us know that he was expecting us and was responding accordingly. Shells began to fall a little way in front of us, then behind us, and then amongst us. He had found the range, with the result that some of us began to fall, wounded, killed, at times blown to smithereens. Then their mortars began to take their toll amongst us. By now, of course, our own artillery, the 25-pounders, began to fire, and we could see the resulting explosions in the distance. Also at this time, our own guns were laying down a creeping barrage. This is a barrage of shells which keeps moving just ahead of the infantry, and as we moved forward, so did the barrage, until it was lifted. But sometimes the barrage would fall too short, with unpleasant results. The sappers had gone in quietly during the night to make paths through the minefields, marking them with white tape. I was 25 years of age, but many of the boys around me were only 19 and had never even heard of a 25-pounder, and I don't know what they were thinking. In the early dawn, the enemy dropped very lights from an aeroplane, making the dawn as light as day and showing up every detail clearly. It looked eerie, and very soon we could hear the chatter of machine guns and felt that every bullet was aimed at us personally. The enemy now opened up with 88mm, and the shells were soon bursting amongst us with more accuracy as we advanced about 8 yards apart, with our rifles across our chests. The enemy threw everything at us, and we felt very exposed on that flat plain. Hell, I felt vulnerable, but never afraid. We had other things to think about. Strangely enough, at this stage, fear never entered our heads. The job had to be done, and there was no turning back. 2,000 yards from the gap, there was not even the usual scrub to drop behind. Our 69th Brigade soon ran into trouble. Our C Company made a very spirited attack on Point 85 and took it with the loss of some good men. The East Yorks and the 7th Battalion were pinned down by heavy frontal and enfilade machine gun fire. This is where weapons can be directed, for instance, on a column or a row of troops, such that the projectiles travel the length of the column or row. The 4th Indian and 51st Highland had been successful in their initial attacks and somewhat reduced the firing down onto us, and we advanced cautiously. As we got nearer to the enemy and could sense the height of Fat Nasser and Rumana above us, the fire from their machine guns, mortars and 88s slackened off because we were below their line of fire, except for a time to the left of us. Up to now, tanks had not put in an appearance, as they would have been very exposed on that flat ground, and were waiting until the soldiers took the Jebels. By the time we had reached the above-mentioned position, the Gurkhas had already gone into action in the dead of night in their usual way, stealthily, without any artillery support whatsoever. Their kukris, a very sharp, curved, broad knife, about 18 inches long, demanding a heavy penalty, These very brave soldiers from Nepal must have put the fear of death into the enemy. On the other hand, the enemy would not live long enough to be afraid, because in seconds his decapitated head would be on the ground. Also, during the dark hours, under cover of our 25-pounders, one tank had reached the anti-tank ditch and filled about 10 yards of it in, sufficient for us to cross over. This tank had been knocked out and was still on top of the filled-in ditch, and a very gory sight confronted us. The tank commander had been killed, I would say, by machine gun fire. His body, or what remained of it, was hanging over the edge of the turret. It had almost been cut in two. His head and shoulders were intact, but the whole middle of his body was splattered over the side, the intestines hanging out where the stomach had been ripped open. Blood flowed freely. The commander must have been standing in the hatch observing when the tank was hit. What an awful sight! How cheap life was! Many of our young ones had not been in action before, and this was the sight which greeted them. I wonder what their thoughts were, because no matter what, this was war, and our job had to be done. I passed within 6 feet of that tank, and the hordes of flies were already at work. It was a good job that the tank commander's loved ones would never know how he had died. Just killed in action covered every eventuality in war. We crossed the ditch and started to enter the foothills, but were pinned down for a while, being overlooked from higher ground. The hills had slit trenches all over them, so were good for defence, and we could see nobody to fire back at. But eventually we managed to make some headway, keeping our bodies low, and then separating into our individual sections, all the while being shelled, mortared and sniped, suffering casualties. The Wadi Akarit, a dried-up riverbed, was about 5,000 yards long, running inland from the sea. My section moved along the top of the wadi, advancing further into the hills, then making for higher ground on the right of us. And shells were bursting all the time around us, but happily not too near our section. Then suddenly we were fired upon from across the valley, and one boy was killed as we froze to the ground. The slightest movement of our bodies brought fire to bear upon us for about 20 minutes, until, quite unexpectedly, 2 of our tanks came along the bank of the wadi and fired shell after shell on that machine gun post, pinning us down. We then made our way to join more of our company down the hill in the wadi, which was about 30 feet wide, with almost straight sides, 4 or 5 feet deep, just starting to crumble. I can easily recall having to jump down into it. We were now attacking as platoons and sections, and our section, led by Lance Corporal Coughlin, bending low to the ground, moved to the right, and we had to tread warily because we were very often overlooked. We must have advanced about 200 yards, not realising that we were being observed from a concealed trench. All of a sudden, machine gun fire came from our right, and we dropped flat. We knew roughly where the fire came from, and quite unexpectedly, Coughlin did a silly thing. Without any command, he stood up to move forward, instead of giving us instructions to fire while he observed. He was no sooner on his feet than a single shot rang out, and Coughlin, who was next to me on my right, dropped dead in an instant. It was an awful experience, seeing poor Coughlin's life being ended so suddenly. For a moment, we could not believe it. Then my rage was up, and I, being the senior soldier, took command. It all happened in seconds, and I shouted to the others to keep firing towards the enemy trench on the hillside to make them keep their heads down. Angry, I grabbed poor Coughlin's submachine gun and shouted, "Come on, lads, kill the bastards, send them to hell, but keep firing and don't forget your grenades." Firing as I was running, I killed the first Italian who showed his head. When we were about 10 yards away, we'd reached the top of the slit trench, and we killed the survivors, 5 of them cowering in the bottom of the trench. It was no time for pussyfooting. We were consumed with rage and had to kill them to pay for our fallen pal. We were so intoxicated, we could not hold back, given the chance they would have killed us. This much I'd learned at Dunkirk. No quarter given. And those Italians paid the supreme penalty. It was almost impossible to believe that a healthy young man's life could be ended in a split second. Only a few minutes before I was talking to Coughlin, and now he was dead. That event is still imprinted in my thoughts as if it were yesterday. There was no activity from the air to speak of. The fact is that our fighting was taking place amongst a range of hills, and from the air it must have been impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Whatever the reason, we did not see a single aircraft. Our divisional partners in the battle were holding their own in the attack, and for a very short period there was a lull in firing, and it was almost quiet. After so much gunfire, it was suspected that a counter-attack would be launched, and that is what happened. All of a sudden, the enemy opened up with 88s and mortars, and we made haste to our various section positions while our supporting artillery reacted to the enemy shelling. The 88s were proving to be a great hindrance to us, but they always were. Our battalion was held back a little, while the 4th Indian and 51st Highland advanced further to threaten the enemy, and we moved forward. Then we saw the enemy moving furtively across the hills. Letting them get a little closer, our officers shouted, "Let them have it, lads!" We all jumped up, firing our weapons, as we'd all lost pals and were as mad as hell. Our Bren gunner, a tough kid, was really on the boil and ran forward, firing the Bren from the hip with his number 2, changing magazines as they ran. They were awarded the military medal, and sadly they were both later killed in Normandy. A few of us fell wounded, but the enemy attack was too inadequate to succeed. This was really no tank country, so the enemy only used infantry against us. And our blood was up, so we gave them bloody hell. It took another 4 hours of killing and winkling out the enemy from his trenches and filthy dugouts in the hillsides before the firing quietened down, then stopped. They did not take much persuading to put up their hands and be herded back behind us. We went over the whole area which had been held by the enemy, finding caves which had been dug into the hillsides, and in many of them you could smell perfume, and there was much evidence of females having been present. The Italians liked their comforts. Though we had heard about these things previously, it had been hard to believe, but now we knew. As we went about our work, some of our boys walked into an anti-personnel minefield, and a few were wounded. There was much clearing up to be done, and the odd sniper to be dealt with. Then the opportunity came to rest for an hour, and a meal was brought up to us, which was always bully stew and boiled rice on these occasions, and it was always good. Mess tins out into the queue, and we were soon feeling replete, but not so much that we couldn't continue fighting. We just sat around talking of the day and its happenings. There'd been no rest since the early hours of the morning, so many of us lay on our backs, smoking, trying to relax. Our company commander settled us all down and said he was very satisfied with the way we'd conducted ourselves, which was typical of Captain Hull. We had lost many good soldiers, but it was not possible to escape from the things we'd witnessed until we had to move on. Then we would accept that these killings were unavoidable. It would be fatal to dwell too much on what we'd experienced. Years later, I discovered that the Green Howards and East Yorkshires had killed or captured practically the whole of the Italian Spezia division. Our casualties in the 6th were several officers killed and wounded, together with 120 other ranks. It had been a sad day, and we welcomed a few days' rest to lick our wounds. After the meal, another boy and I were detailed to go and bury one of our lads who'd been killed. It was too hot to leave bodies lying around, and the stretcher bearers were busy taking care of the wounded. So off we went with our entrenching tools. Although I had seen a good many dead soldiers, I had never been called upon to bury one. Unfortunately, there was no body as such, but only the gruesome remains. It had been blown to pieces. The legs and one arm were lying yards away. There was no face, and the body was ripped apart. Never before had I seen anything like it, and I found it very difficult to contain myself. We dug a shallow grave in the stony ground and put the torn limbs into it, and then I found the identity discs, and to my horror, I found the dead boy to be Arthur Oxley, one of my pals on the Queen Mary. We looked around for any other things belonging to Arthur, and found half of a Green Howard cap badge. It was twisted by the blast, and I still have it as a memory of my pal. I don't know how I contained my emotions at that moment. Together we made a cairn of stones on the grave, hoping that it would be found. Though it was such a lonely hillside, I did not think it would be discovered. We left one identity disc with the body. The other we took back to our officer, to whom we explained what we had done. How strange it was that despite the trauma of such events, these things were of necessity put to the back of my mind. We could not allow ourselves to be influenced unduly. It was time to move on. The enemy had fled, leaving many bodies and weapons lying around. It had been one hell of an experience. On our way through the low hills, we finally ended up on level ground, and the first thing we saw was a battery of abandoned 88mm guns. It was the first time I had seen that powerful weapon which was so much talked about and which played havoc amongst us. We could not go too near them in case there'd been booby traps or the Germans had left mines around. All next day I could not forget how a human body could be so violated as was Arthur Oxley's. I was certain the body wouldn't be found, but nevertheless I later wrote to the War Graves Commission and was informed that the body had been recovered and buried in grave number 26, plot 2, row D, at the Sfax War Cemetery in Tunisia. We now rested. Guards posted forward, and it was soon dark. Then we slept where we were, on the ground, our heads on our packs. This sad day was over, and it was said that the Battle of Wadi Akarit was one of the most successful fought by the 8th Army. Our company commander won the MC. The 8th Armoured Brigade, followed by the New Zealand Division, now passed through our lines and continued to pursue and harass the enemy on his retreat to Tunis. Next morning we walked only about 5 miles and were halted for 2 days. The 5th East Yorkshires had also come to rest next to us, so I went over to see if I could find John Bousfield, who'd been my best pal on the Queen Mary, only to be told he'd been killed by one of our 25-pounder shells, which had fallen short during the creeping barrage. It was a bitter blow to me. It was almost impossible to believe that both Arthur and John, 2 grand young men, had been killed, when only a short time ago we'd been laughing and joking. John was only 19 years of age. His parents had the Turk's Head Hotel in Stockton. It was a stark reminder that under the circumstances in which we lived, our life was of little significance, and we had to live from day to day. It would not have been healthy for us to dwell on whatever emotions we could have given way to, but they were such days of sadness. Being an infantryman was indeed a demanding life with many hurdles which we had to adapt ourselves to overcome. Sometimes it was a trial of strength between our head and our heart, but common sense and duty usually prevailed, and yesterday's happenings were put in the back of our thoughts until some time in the future. What a tragedy war is! Amongst the many other casualties at Wadi Akarit were Sergeant Mason, Corporal Smith, the company commander's batman, and Regimental Sergeant Major Carter. I'll never forget 6th of April 1943, and every year on that date I think about Wadi Akarit. End of chapter 12.